Welcome to the YouTube channel for Sunset Canyon Baptist Church. My name is Russell Dixon, and I have the privilege of serving as the senior pastor here. You know, the only way we can bring messages like the one you're about to watch, both to our YouTube channel and to our podcast, is through the generosity of not only our church family, but also of you, our extended family. So if you would like to contribute to help support the work that God is doing through this ministry financially, you can go to our website at sunsetcanyonchurch.org and simply click on the button that says Give. We hope that this week's message encourages you to seek Jesus, and we pray that it helps you to grow in your walk with Him. Now, here's this week's message.
Good morning, Canyon Church. I am so thankful for Philip and our praise team in leading us in worship this morning. My third year of law school was a tough season in my life. It was a tough year for me. And it was during that year that Gungor released their song, Beautiful Things, and it has always held a special place in my heart. And thank you so much for leading us in that important moment of worship as we head into our new year. My name is John Litzler, and if you're wondering which of the pastors I am on staff, let me save you a little bit of time. I'm not one, so there you go. I'm married to Stephanie Litzler, the children's minister here, and I also work as general counsel for the Baptist General Convention of Texas, and I appreciate Pastor Russell giving me the opportunity to speak with you this morning here on the last day of the year as we waltz into the new year. You know, today's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Okay. All right, got it. No more dad jokes. Got it. No more dad jokes. But last day of the year, you know, as we head into a new season, I want to show you a meme that I saw on social media this week. As I was on social media this week, I saw this meme, and I want you to see what it says. It says, "I don't want to end the year on bad terms with anyone, so apologize to me." And I think it's great, and I love the humor. But just like with every meme, underneath the humor, there's kind of a kernel of truth there, isn't there? There's always some little kernel of truth to it. We don't want to end the year on bad terms with people. As we spend time with family, as we prepare for a new season, a new start, we want a new start in our relationships as well, don't we? We want to forgive one another, and we want to reconcile relationships. We have that desire as the year ends. Now, I don't know what comes to your mind when you hear the word reconciliation. If you work in accounting or in finance, you may think of reconciling accounts, you know, where you have two sets of records and you compare them, and maybe you find some discrepancies and you have to resolve those discrepancies. It used to be that every family did something like that at least once a month. We called it balancing your checkbook. Remember that? Some of our young folks tend to sit this way. Just so you know, a checkbook was kind of like... It was a stack of papers, and if you didn't have money to pay for something, you just kind of write an IOU on it, and then people could take that to the bank to get money for the item, and they bound them all together, and that's why we called it a book. It was a checkbook. That was before you could just tap debit cards, and certainly before Cash App and Venmo and all of that kind of stuff. But if you're not in accounting, maybe you're in politics and lawmaking, and you think of reconciling as when the House of Representatives and the Senate pass two different versions of a bill, and the language doesn't perfectly match, and it can't become law if they've got different versions, and so they appoint what's called a conference committee, and representatives from each chamber get together, and they try to make the language identical. They have to reconcile the bill before it can become law. Or maybe you grew up in a Catholic church, and you're familiar with the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church, one of which is the sacrament of penance, also known as the sacrament of reconciliation. We think of it as confession, when you go to the priest and you confess your sins, and therefore you're reconciled to God for sins you've committed even after baptism, and also to your fellow Catholics. Or maybe you didn't grow up Catholic and you're not in one of those fields and you don't really think much about the word reconciliation. It sounds like a fancy church word that nobody uses in average everyday life. And if you think that way, you're absolutely right. We don't really use it. So what I want to try to do is provide us with a working definition of reconciliation. It's not perfect, but what do Christians mean? And what do people mean when they use that word at church? What are we talking about? And so if you've got your listener guide, just kind of wave it in Russell's general direction here so he knows that we're on track this morning. And I'm going to try to give us, it's not perfect, but hopefully a working definition of reconciliation, a place where we can start. Reconciliation is a return of a relationship to a harmonious state after a period of conflict. It's the return of a relationship to a state of harmony after some period of conflict. Look with me, if you will, at 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 16 through 19. It says this: "So from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. Therefore, if anyone is Christ, the new creation has come. The old is gone, the new is here." Just as Philip and our praise team led us a moment ago as we were singing about beautiful things. You make me new. You are making me new. Verse 18. "All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them, and has committed to us the message of reconciliation." So you can see from these verses that God has entrusted to us the message of reconciliation, and what a beautiful message it is. That's right there in verse 19. It's the most wonderful message that there is, that we can be reconciled to God. That harmonious state in our relationship can be returned. The balance sheets can match. The language can match because of Christ's sacrifice for us on the cross. There is no more powerful message. It is quite literally the gospel. But we also see that because God has reconciled us to himself through Jesus, we're tasked with the ministry of reconciliation. You see that in verse 18. The Message paraphrases verse 18 like this: "All of this comes from the God who settled the relationship between us and him, and then called us to settle our relationships with each other." In other words, because we have the message of reconciliation to God, the vertical reconciliation, now we must practice the horizontal reconciling relationships with one another. So what is reconciliation? It's like forgiveness, but it's a little bit different. They're not quite the same. And I want to point out a couple of key differences for you this morning. First, reconciliation is reciprocal. It takes two parties. It has to go both ways. Forgiveness is a single party action. It's something you do as much for yourself as you do for another person. You can give forgiveness freely, regardless of whether the other person accepts it. In fact, I don't even need you to apologize in order for me to forgive you. I can just do it. But in order for us to reconcile our relationship, in order for us to really truly return to a harmonious state, you have to want to heal the brokenness in our relationship, and I have to want to heal the brokenness in our relationship. In some ways, you can think of reconciliation as forgiveness in action. And because of that, it's not always possible. Reconciliation is harder than forgiveness. The other person may not want to reconcile with you. It may not always be possible. It may not also always be wise. There are situations where it may not be wise. If you've come out of an abusive relationship, reconciliation may not be wise. But despite the fact that it's hard, and despite the fact that it may not always be possible, and despite the fact that it may not always be wise, we need to be as generous as we can be with the ministry of reconciliation. Paul writes this in Romans 12:18. He says, "If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with one another." Now, it may not be up to you, but as far as it depends on you, be generous with the message and the ministry of reconciliation. The second big difference between reconciliation and forgiveness is that reconciliation is a process. It doesn't happen instantaneously. Forgiveness, it may take you a while to work up to it, but once you forgive someone, it's done. Now, you may also have to remind yourself afterwards a few times that you've forgiven that person. But it happens in that moment. Reconciliation is gradual. It takes work. It takes hard work. You have to do it step by step. And I'll give you an example so you know what I'm talking about. Some of you may have a teenage driver in your home. Some of you may have already survived those years. And some of you may be dreading that they're on the way. But imagine you have a teenage driver in your home and you're allowing that person to drive one of your family vehicles and they do something reckless and they crash it. Okay? They get in a wreck. Maybe they were texting while driving or something like that. And so you decide that, not in a malice or vindictive type way, but you want them to learn a lesson about responsibility and the sacrifice and the cost of mistakes and consequences for their actions. And so you say that they need to get a job and they're going to pay you back. You're going to fix the car, but they need to get a job and they're going to pay you back. And they start doing that. And after some time, you realize, okay, the lesson's been learned. They still owe a lot of money and they're not going to be paying this back for a while. I'm going to forgive that debt they owe on the car. That happens instantaneously. You forgive the debt and it's done. They don't need to pay you another dime. It's done. But repairing the broken trust in the relationship is more gradual than that, isn't it? Maybe at first they can only drive while you're still in the car, so you can make sure they're practicing good driving habits. And then maybe they can take short trips but without the phone, so there's no texting. And then maybe they can go without you and the phone, but only around the corner, and then gradually longer distances or however you do that. But it takes time to reconcile. It's not as instantaneous as forgiveness. So, as I said earlier, clearly the message of reconciliation is important. It's crucial. It's the gospel message. There's nothing more important. But the ministry of reconciliation is also important. Maybe you've heard the phrase, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. In other words, you may have really good knowledge and really helpful knowledge, but if I don't believe you have my best interest at heart, if I don't think you care about how that knowledge is going to be applied in my life, why would I listen? Why would I give you an opportunity to share it? So if people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, people are not going to care about your message of reconciliation until they can see your ministry of reconciliation. Your audio and your video have to match up. You can say things about forgiveness and reconciliation all day, but if I don't ever actually see you practicing it in your life, you're just a hypocrite. Why would I listen? So I want to give an example. I'm blessed in my house, in the Litzler household, we have a resident theologian. Her name is Stephanie. She's a theologian, and she lives at our residence, so she's a resident theologian. And she has all these books on our shelves from her time in seminary, and one of those books is called Flawed Families of the Bible. And if you've read the Bible, you can imagine Flawed Families of the Bible is not a thin book. There are a lot of flawed families, and one of those flawed families is Jacob and his family. And I want us to look briefly at the brokenness and the dysfunction in Jacob's family as kind of a modeling example of what reconciliation looks like with the rest of our time this morning. Jacob's parents had favorites, and he was his mom's favorite, a mama's boy, if you will. And his older brother Esau was his dad's favorite. Now, this is going to be a 40,000-foot view of the dysfunction in this family. I would encourage you to read this story for yourself. Even if you've read it before, go back and read it again. It's in Genesis chapter 28 through 41. But fortunately for your sake, we're not going to go through all 13 of those chapters line by line. So I thought about maybe ordering in lunch, but we'll not this time. So I'll just kind of give you a breeze through of it. It's not going to contain everything in those chapters, but here's the gist of it. Jacob was a trickster, and he stole his brother's birthright and inheritance. With the aid of his mother, he was able to deceive his father and steal that. And it made his brother Esau so mad that Esau wanted to kill him. And so again, with the help of his mother, Jacob flees and runs away to his uncle Laban's place, his uncle on his mother's side, his mother's brother, not his dad's brother. They're not on good terms. And so he goes to his uncle Laban's, where his uncle strikes a deal with him that if he'll work for 7 years, he can marry Laban's daughter, Rachel. And he does work for 7 years, but at the end of those 7 years, Laban gives him his oldest daughter, Leah, to marry instead. He's tricked. The trickster has been tricked by his uncle, and he marries the woman he really doesn't want to be with. And then all of about a week later, he marries Leah's more beautiful and younger sister, Rachel, who he actually does want to be with. And now he's got 2 wives. and he promises to work for Laban for another 7 years. Leah starts having children, and of great significance in the patriarchal society into which this story takes place, she starts having male children, heirs for Jacob. Rachel is barren. She doesn't have children. And Rachel is jealous, and so she gives her maidservant Bilhah to Jacob to marry as his wife. And Jacob starts having children with Bilhah. And then Leah stops having children, and she gets jealous of Bilhah, and so she gives her maidservant Zilpah to Jacob as a wife, and he starts having children with Zilpah. So Jacob is a very busy man. He's married to 4 women, and he's having lots of sons when Rachel finally gives birth to her first son named Joseph. It's Jacob's 11th son overall, and because Joseph is Rachel's son, and Rachel is Jacob's favorite wife, Joseph becomes Jacob's favorite child. Jacob didn't learn much about how that favoritism in the family thing works out, does it? He didn't learn much of a lesson there. And he has a favorite son, and that does not go well. And so Joseph's half-brothers come to hate him and resent him, so much so that they want to kill him. Now, ultimately, they don't kill him. Their oldest brother convinces them not to, and instead, in what is one of the earliest recorded incidences of human trafficking, they take their brother and they sell him into slavery. Now, I don't know how rough your Christmas was this last week, but it probably wasn't as rough as Jacob and Joseph's family, huh? Maybe if nobody was trying to kill one another or sell family members into slavery, we have a little perspective on the brokenness and dysfunction of Joseph and Jacob and their family. But God works through it all, and in slavery in Egypt, Joseph goes from slavery to prisoner to second in command of Egypt. And through God's favor, Joseph is able to interpret dreams and know that a famine is going to come to the land, and he prepares Egypt, and they store grain and food, and they are ready when the famine comes, when no one else in the region is ready. And so ultimately that brings Joseph's 10 older starving brothers back to him. They come to Egypt. Now, time has passed, about 22 years, and they don't recognize Joseph. But Joseph recognizes them, and here's the scene in Genesis 42, verses 18 through 20. On the 3rd day, Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go and take grain back to your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother," that's his brother Benjamin, the 12th that was born after him, the only brother younger than him, "to me, so that your words may be verified and that you may not die." This they proceeded to do. So he tells them to leave one of the brothers behind, and the other 9 of you go back and get Benjamin, and then I'll know that you're not spies and that you're not trying to trick me and deceive me. So they leave Simeon. Now, we don't know. The Bible doesn't describe what Pharaoh's palace looked like. I'm not sure what Joseph's living quarters were as the second in charge there. I don't know where the prison was. But Joseph knew where the prison was because he had been imprisoned there in Egypt. So he knew where Simeon was being held. In fact, it's possible he even put Simeon in the same prison cell where he himself had been captive. Wouldn't that be some poetic justice in his mind? And I don't know if he had to walk past it every day, but I do know this. It was about 175 to 200 miles from Egypt to Canaan, where his brothers lived. In those days, that type of travel would have taken anywhere from 10 to 14 days. Could have taken up to 2 weeks. And we know from the Bible that when they got there, they didn't immediately turn around and came back. They couldn't convince their father to let Benjamin go, and they waited till the food was gone, and they were starving again, and finally they convinced their father to let him go back another 2 weeks back. So we're talking well over a month that Simeon was there in prison while his brothers were gone. I don't know what was going through Joseph's head, but I wonder if he was thinking, how do I want to play this? How do I want to handle this? They're starving. I'm second in charge. Do I have to forgive them? Do we have to reconcile? What do I want to do here? And I wonder if he drew back on any experiences that he had in his life. If he thought, has reconciliation ever been modeled for me? What does reconciliation in this situation look like? And I know that it had been modeled for him at least once because we have a record of it in Genesis chapter 33. In fact, it's the first time Joseph ever meets his uncle Esau. I want to read it to you. Jacob looked up, and there was Esau coming with 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 female servants. He put the female servants and their children in front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph in the rear. He himself went on ahead and bowed down at the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Are you getting this image in your mind? Then Esau looked up and saw the women and children and said, "Who are these with you?" Jacob answered, "They are the children God has graciously given your servant." Then the female servants and their children approached and bowed down. Next, Leah and her children came and bowed down. Last of all came Joseph and Rachel, and they too bowed down. So Scripture tells us not once, but twice explicitly exactly where Joseph was standing when he saw his dad and his uncle reconcile. Esau had wanted to kill Jacob. It was the whole reason Jacob had run away from home in the first place, because he had done something wrong. He had cheated his brother, and now he's running for his life. And when they get back together, notice how verse 4 describes the scene that Joseph would have seen. Esau threw his arms around his brother. He wrapped his arms around him. He kissed him, and they wept together. That's an experience that Joseph had to draw from when he was wondering what it looked like to see reconciliation modeled for him. Ultimately, Joseph does decide to reconcile with his brothers, doesn't he? And he makes himself known to them. And we have that in Genesis 45, verses 12 through 15. Listen to this. Joseph says, "You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I, Joseph, who am speaking to you. Tell my father about the honor accorded me in Egypt, and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly." Then he, Joseph, threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping. And he kissed all of his brothers and wept over them. Afterwards, his brothers talked with him. Joseph reconciled with his brothers in the exact manner he had seen his father and uncle do years earlier. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that a powerful story? I think it's one of the most beautiful stories in all of Scripture. It shows the importance of modeling reconciliation. So what are we doing, church? Are we modeling this type of radical reconciliation in our lives? Senior adults in the room, let me ask you for a second. Are you modeling this for the next generation the way Jacob and Esau modeled this for Joseph and his brothers? The young folks, I kind of teased earlier about the definition of a checkbook. When they look at your life, do they see this modeled? Church, don't we want the world to know the message of reconciliation to God? Then we've got to model the ministry of reconciliation to God. That's the whole point. Let me provide you one more example. It's a little bit more modern, and I'll close with this example in this story. After a period of apartheid in South Africa, where racial segregation was institutionalized for a period of about 50 years, a man named Nelson Mandela, who you probably know from history, was freed from prison. He had been in prison for 27 years for his political activism and his opposition to apartheid. And in South Africa's first multiracial election, where all races were freely enfranchised to vote, he was elected president of South Africa, their first ever black president in South Africa. Now, Mandela was also a Christian, and he knew that the message of reconciliation was important, but that if he wanted his country to get the message of reconciliation, then he needed to model the ministry of reconciliation. In particular, he was tasked with racial reconciliation in his country. He had to find a way to heal a nation that had been ripped apart by racism and segregation. He created a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he received a lot of pushback from black South Africans who were still reeling from over 50 years of violence against them and oppression of them. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the area of rugby, of all places. Their national team sport. The South African rugby team was historically all white, and everything about them was a symbol of white supremacy to black South Africans. The uniforms they wore, their name, the Springboks. So much so that black South Africans would actively cheer for the Springboks' opponents in rugby matches. They would cheer against their own country for whatever other country to win. Didn't matter what country was coming to town to play them, they hoped South Africa would lose. And Mandela used the 1995 Rugby World Cup, which his country hosted, as an opportunity to begin racial reconciliation efforts in his country. I've got a picture of him here. He put on a Springbok uniform and colors, something he himself described that while he was in prison those 27 years, he viewed as a symbol of white supremacy in his country. And he put it on as the president of the country, and he went out there to their first rugby match. And they won. And they continued to win. And ultimately, they won the Rugby World Cup in 1995, and there's a powerful image of Nelson Mandela, the country's first black president, handing the championship trophy to the captain of the Springbok rugby team. The movie Invictus that came out in 2009 captures this story well. And here's what Martin Meredith wrote in Mandela's biography later about his life, about that event and that game. The whole of South Africa erupted in celebration, blacks as joyful as whites. Never before had blacks had cause to show such pride in the efforts of their white countrymen. It was a moment of national fusion that Mandela had done much to inspire. You see, Mandela understood that if his country was going to get the message of reconciliation, he had to model reconciliation. He had to be in the practice of the ministry of reconciliation. And we have to do the same. In just a moment, we're going to give you an opportunity to respond. That's something that we do every week at this church. We believe it's an important and powerful time. Don't know how God has spoken to you this morning, but maybe this all sounds a little weird. Maybe it sounds like a really radical thing. I mean, we're talking about reconciling with people that tried to kill you, that sold you into slavery, that oppressed you and hate you because of the color of your skin. And if you don't know that type of radical forgiveness and reconciliation with God, it can sound a little out there. And so maybe you're realizing that you can't fully understand the ministry of reconciliation because you haven't accepted the message of reconciliation. If that's you, in just a moment, I would encourage you to come speak with our pastor. Pastor Russell is going to be down here standing in front. Maybe you need to model the ministry of reconciliation. Maybe you need a moment to come down here and pray about that. Maybe that's your first step. Maybe there's someone in this room you need to go tap on the shoulder and begin that reconciliation process, to throw your arms around each other and weep and kiss each other figuratively, just as Joseph did with his brothers, just as Jacob and Esau did. Or maybe you're thinking, I don't have the relationships in this church to even begin to heal because I haven't broken any, because I just don't have any relationships in this church. I don't have any relationships to work on because the relationships aren't there. I want to tell you, this church isn't perfect, but it's a church that strives to engage in the ministry of reconciliation and heal things between us when we're broken. If you want to know more about that and what it means to be a member of this church and to have those type of relationships with a group of people who strive to practice the ministry of reconciliation, I'd encourage you to come down and talk to Pastor Russell about that.